The papers were signed at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning in the offices of Whitfield and Crane on the sixth floor of the Aldermere building, and Roe Callister signed them with the pen the paralegal handed him and handed it back and stood and put on his jacket and shook the hand of his own attorney, which was a thing he did because it was the correct thing to do and not because he felt anything in particular about the outcome. The outcome was this. Isla kept the house in Crestwood, the joint accounts, the investment portfolio his grandfather had started in 1987 and which had grown over 31 years into something substantial, and the Audi that had been a gift on their 10th anniversary. Roe kept primary custody of Maisie, who was 8, and a bank account with enough in it to cover 6 months of careful living and an address on the Aldermere East Side that had been his mother's before she died, and which Isla's attorney had been unable to touch because it had never been put in joint names. He took the elevator to the lobby. He walked through the revolving door into the cold March air. He had parked 3 blocks away because the garage nearest the building charged $19 an hour, and he was being careful now about $19. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 with a replaced transmission and a heater that worked on the driver's side only. He sat in it for a moment with the engine running. Then he drove to Maisie's school and waited in the pickup line with the other parents, and when she came out she climbed in and said, "Did it happen?" And he said yes, and she said okay, and she put her backpack between her feet and looked out the window at the passing street, and neither of them said anything else until they were home. The house on Clement Street was small and old and smelled of the particular combination of wood and radiator heat that old houses in the East Aldermere district produced in winter. He had been sleeping in the house for 2 weeks already, since the separation agreement had given him the address, and he had not done much to it yet beyond putting Maisie's things in the larger bedroom and buying a second-hand kitchen table from a woman on the next block. He made dinner that night, pasta, because it was what he knew how to make, quickly and without thinking, and Maisie sat at the new table and did her homework while he cooked, and he thought about nothing in particular, or tried to, and mostly succeeded. He had been a civil structural engineer for 14 years. He had left the firm of Barrow and Veld 18 months ago, not under circumstances he would have chosen, but under circumstances he had chosen nonetheless, which was a distinction he had spent some time getting clear in his own mind. The project had been a pedestrian overpass in the Fenwick district, and the loading specifications had been altered in the final construction phase by a site manager who answered to a developer who had been trying to cut 6 weeks off the schedule, and Roe had caught it on a site visit and filed an internal objection, and the internal objection had been absorbed by the firm the way firms absorbed things that cost money to acknowledge, which was quietly and completely. He had escalated to the city's structural oversight body 3 days later. The overpass had been halted. The developer had lost 8 months and a significant portion of his financing. The firm had parted ways with Roe by mutual agreement, which was one of the ways firms said what they meant without saying it. He had taken a position with a municipal maintenance contractor in the months that followed, doing structural assessments on city infrastructure, bridges, and retaining walls, and the older buildings that required a professional eye and a signed report. It paid a third of what Barrow and Veld had paid. It required steel-toed boots and early starts, and the occasional afternoon standing in a drainage culvert with a flashlight. He had told Isla about it in the way that people tell the truth when they are no longer willing to manage how it lands. She had absorbed it the way she absorbed most things about him in the last 2 years of the marriage, which was with the flat and faintly disappointed expression of a woman revising a set of expectations downward. He had not blamed her. He had been revising them himself. What he had not told her, had not told anyone in the 16 months since the separation, was that he had kept the firm he had registered 7 years earlier as a private structural consultancy, dormant, a numbered company with a single active contract he had never discussed at home, because the contract was with a government infrastructure authority and required a confidentiality agreement, and because by the time the marriage had reached the state where financial transparency would have mattered, transparency had stopped feeling safe. The contract was worth $420,000 annually and had been renewed twice. The numbered company had a trust account. The trust account was not his name. Iris Calloway ran the East Aldermere office of Calloway Property Group on a schedule that began at 7 and ended when the work was finished, which was usually somewhere between 7 and 9 in the evening, depending on whether the market had been cooperative that day, and the market had not been particularly cooperative in the past quarter. She was 41, and she had built the office from a two-person operation into the dominant residential brokerage in the district over 9 years, and she was good at her work in the specific way that people were good at things they had chosen deliberately rather than inherited or fallen into. She was also, in a way she had not designed and did not entirely welcome, the sort of person who noticed things. She noticed the truck first, the 2009 F-150 that was in the Clement Street neighborhood most mornings, parked with precision, the kind of parking that meant the driver had a system and not that the driver had gotten lucky. She noticed the man second when he was carrying a collapsed cardboard box from the back of the truck into the number 14 on Clement, which was the old Callister house that had been sitting dark for 3 years after the previous owner died. She noted the house and the man and the truck and did not think about any of them again until Thursday of the same week, when she was showing a two-bedroom on the far end of Clement and parked behind the F-150 and saw the structural assessment report on the passenger seat through the window. She could not read the detail, but she could read the letterhead, which was the City Infrastructure Authority's standard format, a document she had seen on a dozen properties in 9 years. She noted that too. She met the man in person for the first time at the Clement Street Community Board meeting on the following Monday, which she attended because she attended all of them, and which he apparently attended because he had moved into the district and understood that this was a thing residents did. He sat 2 rows ahead of her and to the left. He had a notepad and he used it, which was not something most people at community board meetings did. She watched the back of his head for 2 reasons. One was that the agenda item about the Fenwick pedestrian overpass rehabilitation was interesting to her professionally because 3 properties she represented were adjacent to the Fenwick corridor and the rehabilitation timeline affected their valuations. The other reason she could not have articulated precisely and did not try. He spoke during the Fenwick item. He did not raise his hand the way most people raise their hands at community board meetings, with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who wants to be called on and is not sure they will be. He raised it once, clearly, and was called on, and he gave a specific and economical account of the load-bearing implications of the rehabilitation plan that the board's own presenter had glossed over, and he did it in 2 minutes without notes. And when he was finished, the board chair asked him if he was with the authority, and he said he was not. He was a resident, and then he sat down. Iris looked at the back of his head, and then at her notepad, where she had written nothing for the past 4 minutes. After the meeting, she introduced herself at the door. She said she was local property, and that the Fenwick corridor mattered to some of her listings. He said his name and shook her hand. She said she'd noticed he had an infrastructure report in his truck. He said he did assessments for the city. She said was he the one who'd flagged the overpass. He looked at her for a moment, in the way people looked at you when they were deciding how much to confirm. He said that was a matter of public record. She said she'd looked it up 3 years ago when it happened, because 2 of her clients owned in the Fenwick district, and she'd wanted to understand what had stopped the project. He said what had stopped the project was the specifications had been altered. She said she knew that. She'd read the oversight body's report, and she said it in a tone that made clear she had read all of it, and something shifted in the quality of his attention, a small and specific shift, the way a person's posture changes when they realize the conversation they're in is not the conversation they expected to be in. She gave him her card. He took it. He did not give her one in return, and she noticed this and did not remark on it. Maisie came into the Calloway Property Group office on a Saturday because Roe had a site visit in the morning, and his usual arrangement for Saturdays had fallen through, and he had called ahead and asked if it was all right, and Iris had said yes before she had given herself time to think about whether it was all right, and then found that it was. Maisie was 8, and she had her father's attention span and her own entirely separate set of interests, which included large-scale architectural drawings, of which Iris had several pinned to the wall of the back office. Maisie stood in front of the Aldermere waterfront development schematic for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Who drew this?" Iris said, "A planning firm." Maisie said, "It's wrong." She said it with the certainty of a child who has not yet learned the social cost of certainty. Iris asked what was wrong with it. Maisie pointed to the northeastern corner of the schematic and said the setback line didn't match the river boundary, and that her dad had shown her what setback lines were, and this one was off. Iris looked at the schematic, and then at the child, and then at the schematic again. She pulled out the survey map she kept in the flat file below the table and unrolled it beside the schematic. Maisie put her finger on 2 points without hesitation. Iris measured. The child was right by 3 meters. Iris sat down in the chair beside the flat file and looked at the schematic for a moment. She thought about a man who raised his hand once, and clearly at a community board meeting, and spoke without notes, and had taught his 8-year-old to read setback lines. She thought about the trust account she had found in the course of a routine property search 2 weeks earlier, when she had run the address on Clement as standard practice for a new neighbor in a district where she represented multiple properties, and the numbered company that appeared as the registered holder of an adjacent easement, and the name on the numbered company's filings, which was not Rowe Callister, but which contained a director's signature she had seen on the city infrastructure report in his truck. She had not said anything about this. She did not say anything about it now. She rolled the survey map back into its tube and thanked Maisie, who had already moved on to a different schematic and was tilting her head at it sideways. When Rowe came to collect her 2 hours later, Iris said, his daughter had found an error in a waterfront schematic. He looked at Maisie with an expression that was not surprise. He said, "Which one?" Maisie said, "The big one with the river." He said he'd told her about the survey boundary on that site. Maisie said she knew. Iris looked at both of them and said nothing, and felt something she did not immediately attempt to name. Desmond Vane had been the senior partner at Whitfield and Crane for 19 years, and had handled the Callister divorce with the particular, efficient sympathy he reserved for clients whose assets were being divided in directions he privately considered disproportionate. He had not asked Rowe about the numbered company because Rowe had disclosed everything the law required him to disclose, and the numbered company held no assets that fell within the scope of the marital estate, and Desmond had been doing this long enough to know the difference between what he was legally obligated to pursue and what his client had chosen not to volunteer. What he had not anticipated was that Isla Callister's new attorney, a man named Birch, who practiced out of a glass tower in the Aldermere financial district, and who had a reputation for finding things that other people's attorneys had not found, would file a motion to reopen the asset disclosure 4 months after the final decree. Birch's motion cited a property easement in the East Aldermere district, registered to a numbered company, with a director whose signature matched a public infrastructure report filed under Rowe Callister's professional credentials. It was not a clean claim, and Desmond knew it the moment he read it, because the easement was not a marital asset by any reasonable reading of the relevant statute, but it was enough to trigger a disclosure review, and a disclosure review would pull the trust account, and the trust account would show the consultancy income, and Birch clearly knew this. Desmond called Rowe on a Thursday evening and told him what was coming. There was a silence on the line. Then Rowe asked how long he had. Desmond said the motion was filed, and the review notice would arrive in the next 10 days. Rowe said he understood. He said he would call in the morning. Desmond sat with the phone after the call ended and thought about a man who had signed papers with equanimity and shaken his attorney's hand and walked out, and thought about what it meant to understand something with that particular quality of quiet, which was the quality of a person who had been expecting it. 2 miles away, Iris was at her desk at 9:15 in the evening, which was not unusual, when her phone rang with the number of the Aldermere City Planning Office. She answered, because she always answered the planning office. The call was from a contact she had cultivated over 7 years, a senior planner named Greta, who called when things were about to change in ways that affected property values and who expected the same in return, and who was calling now because the Aldermere Infrastructure Authority's consultancy contract renewal list had been made public that afternoon as part of the city's annual budget transparency filing, and Greta had seen a name on it that she thought Iris might find interesting. And she had been right. Iris sat with the information for a moment after the call ended. The consultancy contract was a matter of public record. It had always been a matter of public record. It had simply not been in any of the records she had looked at, because she had been looking in the wrong registry. The trust account followed. The income stream followed. The numbered company's full filing history followed. She sat with all of it, in the pool of light from her desk lamp and the dark office around her, and looked at the waterfront schematic on the wall, the one with the 3-meter error that an 8-year-old had found on a Saturday morning. She thought about Birch's motion, which she had heard about through the property registry, because the easement was in her district, and she tracked all easement filings. She thought about a disclosure review, pulling an income stream that was technically outside the marital estate, but would be characterized by Birch as concealment regardless, because characterization was what Birch was paid for. She thought about Maisie putting her finger on 2 points on a survey map without hesitation. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again and called her own attorney, not at 9:15 in the evening on a Thursday, but the call went to voicemail, and she left a message that was precise and complete and asked for a return call first thing in the morning. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She put on her coat and drove to Clement Street. The light was on in the front room of number 14. She knocked. He opened the door and looked at her, and she said, "I know about the contract, and I know what Birch is going to do with it, and I think there's a way to get ahead of it, and I'd like to explain it to you, if you'll let me in." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Maisie was asleep. The house was quiet and warm. She sat at the kitchen's table and laid it out, all of it, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "The easement is in my district," he said. "Iris." She looked at the table. She said she did not do things she wasn't prepared to explain. He was quiet. It was not the whole answer, and both of them knew it. The disclosure review was filed and completed in 31 days. Iris's attorney had prepared a formal opinion letter establishing the consultancy income as premarital in character and the trust account as non-marital property under the statute, and had filed it alongside the numbered company's full corporate history, which predated the marriage by 4 years and had been correctly excluded from the original disclosure for exactly that reason. Birch withdrew the motion on the 28th day, which was 3 days before the review was due to conclude, which meant he had seen the opinion letter and understood the outcome and chose to exit before the record reflected a failed attempt. His exit was not announced. A court filing simply stopped and the review closed, and the matter was done. Rowe received the confirmation on a Friday afternoon. He read it at the kitchen table, and then he closed the document and put his phone in his pocket and went to pick up Maisie from school. He did not call Iris. He drove to the school and waited in the line, which he had done every school day since March. And Maisie came out with her backpack and climbed in and said, "Did something happen?" And he said, "Something finished," and she said, "Okay," and looked out the window at the street. He drove. After a moment she said, "Is Iris coming to dinner?" He said he didn't know. She said she should come to dinner. She said it in the tone she used for facts she had decided were settled. He looked at the road. He said he would see. That evening he drove to the Callaway Property Group office on the east side, which was 12 minutes from Clement Street, and which he had not been to since the Saturday Maisie had found the error in the waterfront schematic. The lights were still on. Iris was at her desk, which did not surprise him. He knocked on the glass of the front door. She looked up. She came to the door and opened it and looked at him, and he said, "Maisie wants to know if you're coming to dinner." And it came out exactly the way he had intended it to come out, which was as one thing and also as another thing entirely, and Iris understood both of them and said, "Yes, let me get my coat." She locked the office behind her. They walked to the truck in the cold April evening, the street cool quiet, and the light in the trees the particular pale green of early spring, and she got in on the passenger side, and the heater came on, and on her side of the cab it worked perfectly well, and neither of them remarked on this, and he pulled out onto Clement Street and drove toward the house, where a small girl was at the kitchen table with a drawing she had been working on all afternoon, which showed three people in front of a building with a lot of windows, and which she had titled in careful block letters across the top, and which she had left in the middle of the table, where both of them would see it, when they walked in the door.